I am acutely aware that I have outsized coverage, upstream regard, personal regard, respect from my board. I have anchors in the education, justice, equity, transformation, education transformation movements over the last 30 years. Elsa Nunez, Warren Simmons, John Jackson, Makiba McCrary. Like I have.
Oh, Makiba, she was on the podcast.
Yes, Deborah Jewel Sherman. I mean, there isn't a. I'll say it in the affirmative. They have mentored and guided so many, right? A generation to a generation and a half of leaders doing the work day in, day out. And so to have that kind of upstream coverage alignment with a board is rare.
And
philanthropy by design is not curated, and the structures of philanthropy are not designed to do the things that we are attempting to do with it, right? So it's a moment where I think we can do different. We have an ambition to do different. The way I would say it honestly is that I've declared that Nellie Mae, under my leadership, will be known for three things: building will and demand for the idea of education justice. And that is, the language has become so co-opted. And so I often will not say education justice.
Mm-hmm.
I will often say making real the promise of our democracy for every child, or ensuring that every child, regardless of any social, cultural marker, indigeneity, race, class, country of origin, identity, sexual identity, any of the identity politics, that they would hold zero predictive value over the kind of experience that young people would have in school, right? And so I'd say that if I were talking to researchers, if I were talking to parents and community, I am purist in my voice, which is the first thing we will be known for is supporting each and every child to be seen, supported, and cultivated to thrive on their terms, right? Like that's what every parent says they want. And I think when we talk in very pointed ways like that, nuancing it to the various communities, right? But always being like unapologetically authentic, folks get it. And they're like, yes, I want that for my child and I want it for everybody else's children and those that they care about and those that they'll never know, but they still care about. And the second thing that I am committed to the Nellie Mae Education Foundation being known for is supporting infrastructure, right? Philanthropy rarely supports the development of infrastructure or durable mechanisms, right? And so from a community to a state level, how do we actually build infrastructure to interrogate who is least well served? Not some metaphoric, mythical kid out in the ether, but in your community, in your schools, in your district, who's getting short shrift? Why? And if we're doing the first thing, building will, then there is a desire at a community to a state level to respond to what's found and provide not just relief, but absolute opportunity and access to those young people. And then the third is why I am so excited to partner with this board in this moment is to get to a proof point that trust in community, community solutions, community-led innovation can actually lead to impactful outcomes for young people, right? I think we've talked a lot about trust-based philanthropy, but I don't know that any of us has really figured out how to do this thing at scale and still hold a set of values and get to the kind of impact that we know every child deserves. And so I'm committed to us figuring it out and being in the weeds with community, with grassroots, but also grass tops.
Yeah. Okay. So I got follow-up questions.
Yes. Okay.
I got the follow-up questions because I really love sort of identifying in the clarity of those three things that you want to really lead in terms of a legacy of your leadership. So one, why not educational justice?
So it is educational justice.
But why not? You said you sort of steer away from using that language.
Yeah, because more often than not, folks don't actually understand what we mean by justice.
Mm-hmm.
So if I start the story with today, and I am divorced from our country's origin story, if I am divorced from the ways in which anti-Black racism, the ways in which we have methodically sorted, sifted, tracked, mediated access and opportunities to certain young people, right? And this isn't always a white or Black thing. Sometimes it is a rural versus urban versus suburban. Sometimes it is a country of origin, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to go 2 generations back, and to be Jewish was not to be white.
Mm-hmm.
You can go 3 or 4 generations back, and to be Irish was not to be white, right? And so, for whom this idea of public education should be available and a high quality one has been hotly contested, right? And so, if we're coming up on 250 years of our democracy, I'd make an argument that education is the cornerstone of the democracy. It makes real the promise of the democracy in practice. But we also have to acknowledge that we are, 70 years out from Brown, right? And a ruling that had to declare, even in these United States and under this democracy, that full rights access should be afforded to every child, right? We're 60 years out on voting rights. So I often will say to folks, I am part of the first generation of my family born in these United States with full rights and access. And as a researcher, as a scholar, as a practitioner, we also know that if you look at census tracts, you can backward map and you can write a really compelling and almost remarkably reliable narrative on a set of health, education, life outcomes based on census tract. That's not an accident, right? And so when I talk about justice and access opportunities for everyone, it starts to get wonky in this political environment. The words justice, the words equity, folks act like they don't know what it means. So I get real simple, okay? To make real the promise of our democracy for every child. Hard stop.
And yeah, and that's what I suspected, right? Is that you got to meet people where they are.
Yeah.
And people want everyone to thrive, but they're not often willing to take the leaps towards justice in a way that's real practical, day-to-day decision making,
Yes.
stepping up and forward against the powers and the policies that are in place. And what I love about what you just detailed out is often when we are talking about achievement gaps in most of the spaces that I've been in, it fails to talk about the systemic way that the systemic ways which led us here. More often than not, it's always about students and parents and not what students and parents have had to navigate through.
Yes. I mean, I am so aware that there is nothing exceptional or unique about me other than I had a series of opportunities, right? It doesn't imply that I didn't work hard, that I don't work hard. I actually had to say this to someone that was recruiting me a number of years ago. Recruited me for an opportunity. I said no multiple times. In fact, wrote a pretty detailed memo encouraging the organization, and it was a philanthropic entity, to reconsider, to look for a slightly different profile, unsolicited advice. They kept approaching me. For 9 months, they courted me. And then ultimately, they said that I was a little bit too intense. And so this is the period right after George Floyd's murder. And part of the feedback that I gave to the search firm, which was welcome, and offered the principal an opportunity to connect directly, was that there is nothing about these United States that would have you know my name, right? I am the child of a sharecropper, right? And because we as Black folk, we as Black women often don't have a single narrative, that's only part of the narrative. Yes, I am the child of a sharecropper from rural Mississippi that worked from the time that he was, 9, 10, worked diligently, went to college, right? His father went to one of the A&Ts, right, in the 19 teens, and yet we are still sharecroppers. When we talk about access, we talk about opportunities. My father will tell you he largely went to school around sharecropping and harvest season. That is by design, gatekeeping on opportunities, on access, on the kinds of generative opportunities that some are afforded and others aren't. And so, when I talk about opportunity, it's not in abstraction. It is the reality that by the time my parents had me 7 years after my brother, my older brother is 10 times smarter than me. He is a male. He isn't quite as outgoing. I have a winning smile. Right? I was afforded opportunities that he wasn't, through volunteerism, through sweat equity, through working 16 hours a day. My mother afforded me an opportunity to go to some of the best independent private schools in New York City. And from there, I went to independent private high schools and Amherst College and yada, yada, yada. But if I had stayed in my community school district, local zone school, I don't know that I would be here today. And it's not that there aren't folks that come from my community that are sitting in philanthropy, not to suggest that. Mm-hmm. The doors, the access, the tailwinds would not have been moving in my direction in quite the same way. And I actually think we can do something different. Like we don't have to create gladiators out of children, out of community to outpace our systems, right? We
Say
can
more. Why that language? Why gladiators? Like what heroic measures are we placing on our kids? What are we actually placing on their shoulders?
Gosh, I mean, I was struck. Bloomberg as a mayor in New York City with a healthy dose of Bloomberg philanthropies put a lot of energy behind unraveling what were some pretty entrenched ways of operating, where we were criminalizing parents and children as part of an educational neglect discourse, right? So your child, particularly a middle school, a high schooler, isn't showing up to school at some point, and I don't remember, it's been 15, 20 years. I don't know if it's 5 days or 7 days.
It was 10 in Minnesota. So, automatic F, is this where we're going?
Yes. Oh, we going there. We're going there.
Yeah. Right? It was 10. It was 10 here.
Systems conspiring, right? So if at the 5-day mark, you start getting the due notice, at the 7-day mark, you're getting site visits, people knocking on your door. At the 10-day mark, it is a criminal act that your child isn't showing up at school. Right. And so when we talk about communities, children, families having to be gladiators to outpace a set of systems that can often exert negative, corrosive, undue force on some, but is completely invisible to others because it facilitates, it largely does what they expect it to do, generationally so. That's why I call it gladiators.
Yeah. So your second thing was the infrastructure for durable, infrastructure for durable mechanisms or something you said?
Yeah. So it's infrastructure to interrogate who is least well served. Right.
Right. And so
monkey.
Yeah. And so that just leads me to believe. So the conversations that I'm often in around education, I'm just going to go back. It's often, what are we going to do to teach the parents? How are we going to get the students motivated? How are we going to get them to act right in the classroom? Right. And so it feels really one-dimensional to me based on the complexity of things that can impact how they show up, what it's like when they do show up, and the things that they're trying to navigate. What do you think it will take in terms of the conversations for people to understand what that infrastructure will look like beyond the classroom, right? Beyond, because most of the time it seems like it sits with instructional.
Yes.
But there's so many things, the safety to get there. I mean, there's just so much more that feeds in. The only time you hear about them more is when it comes to behaviors that need to be managed.
Yes. Ooh, I have two responses that are fighting to get out.
Okay.
I'll give you the first, which is rooted in my transition to philanthropy. So I was the executive director at Turnaround for Children, had been brought in to interrogate what of the historic models worked for whom, to grow, to lean, to move further into a intervention, if you will, or a response to the chronically underserving, lowest performing violent schools in New York City, Newark, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. So I led those teams. As part of a Rakes-funded initiative, and this was called the BELL, Building Equitable Learning Environments Network, we were afforded a rare opportunity to go on an equity journey. And so this is in 2016, 2017. And I had been in the industry, designing, serving, leading research practice policy efforts on behalf of multi-system involved young people. Think the 16-year-old stuck in middle school,
Mm-hmm.
the court involved young person. At that point, I had been part of the founding team, the senior most person at a series of charter schools serving court involved young people that were child welfare involved and homeless or in transitional housing 12 to 24 months before application. And I was asked to shadow one of our young people.
Mm-hmm.
And I started at their building, this is middle school, waiting for the bus to pick them up in a chaotic, unsafe environment. The bus was late.
I was going, did it come?
It came, but it was late.
Okay.
Young person got on, and there is the anger, angst on this bus of an adult screaming, let's go, let's go, let's go, move it, right? To recoup or reclaim time. But it sets the pace for a day, for an engagement. To a young person showing up at the school, now late, school security officer, moving them through with the same affect, move it, you're late, let's go, to a series of classes where no one stopped to say, I noticed you were late. I noticed you didn't make it to first period. You all right? I noticed you missed breakfast. You usually have breakfast. You okay? You need anything? To a series of worksheets, but not deep critical thinking and engagement. To the young person then showing up for lunch and getting into it with another young person. And I don't, as an administrator, as a researcher, a designer, a practitioner, a nonprofit executive, 15 years in the work, grinding out hyperlocal community, it had not occurred to me that a young person could make it through the entire day, not be seen, and not be substantively engaged academically, emotionally, or intellectually. I had not accounted for that. It literally blew the lid off my head.
Mm-hmm. Can I add?
Game changer. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to add because I also worked with charter schools here. In one of the schools that I worked with, on average, I think at the time, a freshman coming in was about 16 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So the common narrative would say they're taking kids that should be in public in regular traditional schools. And in some cases that could be true, but in this case, it wasn't true. These were kids that actually had gone off the grid.
Yes.
Nobody knew. Off the grid, 14, 15, not in school. Getting recovered from on the avenue or out of JDC or somewhere. They're getting recovered back into the system, right? So criticizing the schools, criticizing the students, but also having a picture in your mind of a 5-year-old that enters school and goes consecutively until they graduate at 17, 18 years old is in fact not their story at all. There's major disruption in years in which they were not engaging in school.
Yes.
And then there's caring adults that are recovering them and getting them stable. And they're coming in 16, 17-year-old, second, third, fourth grade levels, not able to get to grade level, but recovering a lot of ground that was lost because of some other challenges and other systems and complications of things that they had to navigate. And their gladiator wasn't enough to sustain them.
Absolutely. And so this isn't to point a finger, it's to acknowledge that our system has ways of operating, right? That wasn't a unique experience for that child and for so many more in a system that is highly resourced like New York City. And so when I level up to philanthropy, I think we have an opportunity to seed new ground.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I start with we can build will and demand. There's a lot that we actually know about how to do school,
Yeah.
how to create environments that not just say, I see you, but create the experience for young people to be seen, for families, community to be honored. That doesn't require Herculean efforts from children or the educator in the dynamic, right, to rescue. It's a question, how do we do that at scale? Philanthropy can seed new ground, can create the kind of context where we are drawing attention to what is working, not always what isn't, right? And saying, hey, there's this thing over here, and it doesn't cost more money. It is a good use of the tax levy dollar.
So who is the expert in that? Because your third thing was around proof points of community-led innovation, which I love. And philanthropy has put a lot of money into the system.
Yes.
And it has tried to catalyze or an infusion of ideas or strategies, a number of things that were driven from either policy decisions or board decisions. I don't know where they all have come from. But in what you're talking about, where does the expertise come? Who should we be listening to when we're looking at scaling or these proof points or sustained efforts that produce the type of progress that we are really all, regardless of where you sit on this issue? I believe in the commitment to make things better for kids.
Absolutely. I don't think it's one stakeholder group. I don't think it's one constituency that creates the kind of system in the aggregate, let alone systems, right? There are well over 14,000 school districts in this country, each representing unique hopes, dreams, ambitions rooted in the constituency, the young people, the families, the cultures in which they serve. And so I do think it is bringing into right relationship, and we could have a whole conversation, well, more than an hour conversation on what does right relationship mean. But I think it is the parent, caregiver, youth as co-constructors, educators, system leaders, policymakers, researchers coming together to talk about what we know, what we want, how we actually achieve together. And I think that's a role that in that second bucket where I'm saying as a regional funder, Nellie Mae can play a role in helping build community to state infrastructure, the kinds of relationships, the kinds of ways of operating. I mean, I would call out one of our grantees, PLE, right? So Parents Leading for Education Equity in Rhode Island. Back in 2018, parents, caregivers came together with advocates for their children to really respond to a set of district call outs, but also call ins in Rhode Island. And as a result, they were able to build, again, infrastructure to see into shared ambition, right? What does Heather McGee call it? A solidarity dividend.
Mm-hmm.
A solidarity dividend, but from that, they were able to create new and different funding mechanisms, right? Mm-hmm. one of the things that I see playing out with greater emphasis and angst around it is, for whom is this public education system supposed to be designed for? For whom is it serving? Who should pay for it? Right? When I get to the northern tier of New England, Nellie Mae serves the 6 states of New England. And so the northern tier would be Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. It is by no means unique to the northern tier, but I see it in very acute and pointed ways. An aged population, largely on fixed income, right? Significant number of new immigrant families coming in through resettlement, which is a federal action.
Yep.
Gateway communities, which is a governor or state action. And by design, you would want communities that are experiencing population decline to have new infusions of citizens, to stay vibrant, all the things. And yet, most communities, most districts, most states, schools are funded by taxes. It is a local community dynamic. And so, who funds for new immigrants when, again, there is often the very real question of, do I have enough to sustain myself? And
Right.
so what is my commitment to my fellow, and I stop short of saying fellow citizen, because they're not citizens, right? Do I have an obligation to citizens, but not citizens, right? So the nuance of all this starts to get more complicated. But when we look at folks like Plea, again, parents leading for educational equity, they were able to push on a funding formula. So it wasn't a us, them, but a solidarity dividend. Mm-hmm. Right? I think mass budget, another example in Massachusetts, when I think of some of our partners that are moving and leading and building cross-community, cross-stakeholder commitment, will, demand for equitable funding policies that say, I will bring the need and the resource, i.e. the money, the talent, to the young people that need them and when they need them. When folks come together across lines of difference, we see really powerful things happening. So I'd call them out as another example.
I love those call outs. And, there's another, I think, tension, or I will call it a tension. That may not be the right word, but in philanthropy, where there's an attraction of funding programs where there is a quick turnaround on the ROI, right, of the investment, right? Whether it's real or perceived, there's a way to communicate it. Where these long-term, sustained systems level work demands something a little bit different. Yeah. And there's patience that's involved. It's understanding what the policy implications are. And sometimes they get delayed based on whatever the political environment is. And so what advice would you give to philanthropy around, or the tensions or the people that are influencing philanthropy that want sort of the quick return, I would say?
Yeah. I'd encourage us, and I always make the distinction, I am not a philanthropist, I am a philanthropoid. I am the paid professional. It is not my money. So I make that distinction. But I would encourage philanthropists for whom it is their money, and philanthropoids, to really consider what are the tools of philanthropy. And I'd put up 3 or 4. One, philanthropy has no natural check on itself, but it often can be the check, the balance, the incentivizer of the public dollar and also public will. It can seed a whole new set of organizations, industry, ecosystem, nonprofits, whatever language we want to use. When philanthropy moves or pivots, organizations will often follow, not because they are hungry for dollars, but because they are so convicted by what they are seeing in their own communities that they want to respond and they want to bring the resource into their community to provide relief. Right? The third is we have convening power. When we put out invitations, when we host particularly the quiet conversations, people come, they lean in, they share truths with us, right? They share truths with each other. I think, and then the fourth is it can play a long game. It can play a long game that often a political or an election cycle isn't on. And so I think of organizations like in New Hampshire, Reach Higher, right? Reach Higher New Hampshire has been a powerhouse across the state. And in 2021, when multiple bills were introduced to adopt not only a universal voucher program, but a voucher program statewide that would eliminate the public education system in many ways as we know it now, right? There were families, there were folks across all different lines of difference that came together and said, yes, we want to put money in the hands of families. We want decision making to really live with households where possible. And actually, there is a greater utility to a system and a public and fully funded, fair, equitable system. And how do we do both? And that was a set of conversations that only someone down in community can do. And yet, who funds that? Who creates the space? You know, when we think about who were serving, who were the folks that had the luxury of serving as elected officials, at one point, you're talking about the elite. Mm-hmm. The elite because they could afford to live on the salaries.
Yeah. I mean, it's shifting. It is shifting.
It's shifting, but it hasn't fully shifted, right?
Yeah.
So when we talk about and we think about community organizing, when we think about the solidarity dividend, philanthropy can play a role in supporting those that are trusted in community mm-hmm. and bring diverse stakeholders together in service of fair and equitable policy, fair and equitable practice, and an experience of school that tees every child up for what they need. And when I say what they need, I mean literally developmentally. There's so much that we know about the science, about what every one of us needs to flourish.
Mm-hmm. Can you say more about what the solidarity dividend is?
The solidarity dividend is rooted in, I think, the core premise of Americana, right? And there's some folks that call it a myth, that it's real. I believe it's real. An idea that we are better than the singular, that when we invest in our mechanisms to serve all, that's the equity and the justice piece. John Powell talks about the universal goal, mm-hmm. right? But the universal goal is strengthened by the work to understand the targeted universalist, right? He uses the curb cut example, right? So I think of those all as like part of the solidarity dividend. How do we understand who is situated where, what it will take for each child, each community, each one of us to get to not just absolute opportunity, but thrive when we get there. And if and when we do, there is not only innovation, there is shared learning, there is the true benefit of a multiracial democracy that starts to emerge. Mm-hmm. I mean, the reality is that we're more segregated today than we ever were. And so when we talk about a multiracial democracy, for most people, school can be the place where they're meeting new and different people. They're working with, learning alongside, creating meaningful relationships. We don't ensure that schools are that kind of thriving cultural hub then where do we get to not only the shared fate, responsibility, multicultural democracy, but also the skill set, the muscles to be in community together? Where do we get that? If not in school, if not in a healthy public education system.
How do you reconcile the increased segregation with what you just said, right? Like, I mean, this is a lot of intentional acts.
It is.
Individual and collectively. There's a lot of intentional things that you would have to move on, right, to be able to make that be true.
So I'll tell you the core buckets of our strategy that are attempting to incentivize, to strengthen a healthy multiracial democracy and education as the cornerstone of it. Mm-hmm. The first is investments in POC-led, as well as youth, educator, and community organizing and coalitions. So that shows up as general operating support going to organizations that are hyperlocal, community rooted, put the money where it's needed, where folks know and understand the dynamic, the needs, the experience in their unique community. And because we, under this strategy and over the last 5 years, have prioritized hyperlocal, early stage, catalytic investment. Catalytic by design means we are first in or a seed funder. So pairing that general operating support, which by and large for those POC-led organizations, they've received now upward of 3, 4, some are approaching 5 years of investment, general operating support against their own strategic priorities developed in their own communities. But then also deep investments around capacity building. And I don't mean capacity building around a set of equity imperatives. I mean capacity building to get to a level of sustainability, mm-hmm. to become institutionalized, and I don't mean bureaucratic, but institutionalized in their own community. So many of the organizations that we prioritize serving at the top of 2020, 2021, grassroots organizations, 1 or 2 FTEs, wonderful ideas, mm-hmm. that need substantive support to become sustainable. But that through COVID, in the days post George Floyd's murder, through a racial and social reckoning, they were the difference makers in their communities. We don't want those organizations to go away, mm-hmm. right? So how do we support? Trust-based philanthropy works. There are an ilk of foundation-funded organizations for whom we believed in their leadership, we believed in what they were up to, and so we have poured resources into them. And I'm not just talking about money. Access, influence, support to be in community with research, support to be in community with policymakers. And I don't mean voices at a policymaker. I mean actually in community, grappling with, co-constructing, co-designing. We can do that. And so that's part of our first strategy, pairing that Gen Op support with deep capacity building support in community-rooted solutions and organizations. The second is investments in district leadership. Mm-hmm. We know the mobility rates of superintendents and number 2s, instructional soups. But the reality is there is a much broader leadership bench that is often static and stays in community. When I look at the reality of who lives in New England, it is a diversifying set of communities. When I look at the statistics on the number of historically white and rural communities that are now serving ballooning or large POC populations, BIPOC children, what we would call BIPOC, maybe in a country of origin, they don't, but nevertheless, young people that are of a variety of ethnic cultural identities. The infrastructure does not lend itself, the historic resources do not lend themselves to seeing those young people, the nuance, the beauty, the genius of their culture and all that they bring. We can support district personnel to see, understand, and be, again, in right relationship with communities. The third is a deep investment around coalitions, partnership, and movement-related work. Folks that are attuning to both the hyperlocal community, but also thinking about at a policy level, how do we actually understand and come into deeper legislative power, right? So that we are elevating what we know about the needs, the will, the desire, but also creating the kind of equitable infrastructure, the equitable funding formula that brings the money to the most urgent needs.
Yeah.
And doesn't get into a zero-sum dynamic. I can fund this, but I can't fund that.
Mm-hmm. The thing about trust-based philanthropy, and there's a lot of philanthropists and foundations that have done their research. So you're a researcher, and they have the one or two or three things that they believe will address the achievement gap.
That's right.
And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. But then if you're seeking people that have your approach,
yes,
are you trusting that they can execute on what you think? Or is trust-based agreement on the end goal and trusting their process of getting there? Or is it a combination of both or neither of those? Like, what can you make it more plain in terms of like, what does community trust look like? Is it trusting the genius and their approach? Is it a co-creation? Is it all of those things?
I think it's all of those things.
Yeah.
I think, and so that's why I'm mindful to say trust in community solutions and innovation.
Mm-hmm.
If any of us knew, and when I say like knew with an absolute, we would be doing the thing.
Right. Yeah.
we
There's a lot of will.
Yeah, yes, there's a lot of will. There are folks that are and have been dedicating their lives. We've been at this for a long time, generations.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the system, those seeds have been planted, is remarkably consistent, right? And across the country, right? There are a set of dynamics that tend to play out. So that's why I'm mindful to say trust in community-rooted solutions and innovation can be met with impact. Like that's the ambition. I haven't figured out how to do that, right? It's great minds coming together, but the way I process it and the way I talk to my team and with my board about it, I see it as I do, you do, we do. Mm-hmm. So part of the trust is that we are in service of shared ambition. We are not in service of the same thing on a single point, right? And I think there have been alliances formed without calling anyone out, right? This is a calling in around a particular dynamic. I am with you on this model of school or this approach to schooling. And our approach, our understanding of the needs, our centering of community and who is afforded the opportunity to be called community. Because as you said, I'm a researcher, I'm a policy wonk, I am a practitioner, I'm a youth development person, I am a Black woman from El Barrio, Harlem, Spanish Harlem, right? I'm all of that and authentically all of that. But so then this question of how do we distribute power? How do we think about what is the I do? And in philanthropy, I think it's more than just bringing our dollars. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it is calling out what we are seeing. And I tend to talk about we have the luxury of seeing and hearing things first. Mm-hmm. Because folks will tell us things. Folks will share their experience, right? And so we are able, if we're listening, if we're in relationship with a diversity of folks, to see and be able to make meaning, read the tea leaves early.
Yeah.
Right?
You talked a little bit about charter schools earlier, which is leading me to this question, which is often when we talk about the educational system, depending on your experience or where your commitment is, you see it or it could be seen as one type of school versus another type of school, right? It's a traditional district, but not charter schools, not those schools, not those kids. Or it's private, not those schools, not those kids. So when you think about the educational system, what are you looking at? Is it K through college? Like, how do you see educate? Like, are you looking at anywhere that kids are?
Okay, so now you're trying to get me in trouble, right? You can keep that in. Now, so I will tell you, Nellie Mae historically has looked at and focused on K through 12. In our origin story, 24 years ago, we did a fair amount of out of school time. My due north, and again, in my own identity, I'm a youth development person. And so it is about wherever children are. Learning is happening 360. If COVID showed us nothing,
Right.
kids were learning. And there were some, like, are we talking about it? That there were some kids that were thriving at home and in community in very different ways.
We're in fact not talking about that. We're talking about kids that have reverted back a couple years, but we're actually not talking about the kids that thrive. Or
Yeah.
I haven't heard that.
Yes. And there's some children that were thriving. And they're not pink unicorns.
Mm-hmm.
And when we start talking to parents, the number of friends, colleagues, family members that said, my Black boy was thriving in a way that I didn't even have words and I didn't even recognize that he had not been. There's something to learn from that. And that's what I mean by community rooted.
Mm-hmm.
If we are listening and we are in conversation, we're able to triangulate and say, hey, wait a minute. There's something to this. How do we get curious about it?
Mm-hmm. Which is really interesting because what's coming up in my head is the number of people that said, man, being at home to this time, I did not have to navigate the microaggressions and the other things that I had to navigate in the workplace. I actually felt more empowered. I felt more liberated. It's actually been harder for me to go back into the workplace. So why would we think that wasn't so for some of our students?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. Where I could leverage a multiplicity of tools, resources, and ways of knowing a thing.
Yeah.
Right. I could wonk out for like, if you allow me for a second.
Yeah, go for it.
Woman named Jara and the equitable evaluation initiative. Just worth shouting out. She really leans in on this idea that we could and should, in philanthropy, but in the nonprofit system, be taking on who gets to decide what is good, what is just, what is rigorous. That is part of trust-based philanthropy, that we would be negotiating that we would be in a conversation about, well, who gets to be a consultant, big bucks, versus getting an honorarium? What kinds of knowledge, right? Is it degrees? Is it the formal presentation? Mm-hmm. What knowledge do we value? Whose belief system are we anchored on? Those are things that philanthropy and new and emerging cohorts, but also some folks that have been in the game, like my board chair, Dr. Warren Simmons, that is in and of community. In fact, we are from the same community, Spanish Harlem. Mm-hmm. Right? He is a researcher. He is a scholar. He is a practitioner, right? Having worked in systems, having worked in philanthropy, being the 20-year head of Annenberg. Would we ask him to splice aspects of his identity to be a single or sole source? No. Mm-mm. And in fact, I can make a pretty compelling argument that our diverse experiences is part of our genius. It is part of what Toy and I talked about this morning. Yeah. What does it mean to be in community with folks where you don't have to translate?
Okay, so that's a good question.
Girl.
Oh. And what I was thinking about, even when you were saying that, right? Because I say one of the advantages of doing this podcast is that I'm a vessel of many stories told and untold. And as foundations and philanthropy has diversified, it doesn't mean that the diverse people's voice is dominant in these discussions. So if a foundation chose to do the path that you just led them down, to ask those critical questions, to examine it for themselves and what works.
Yes.
And you have a couple of diverse people around the table. Compare, 2 out of 18, 1 out of 5, whatever the number is. How even in that dynamic, because you got to take it down to another level. You getting hot? It's getting hot.
This is where I didn't want to go, but yeah, where we have to go.
Because there's so much genius that's being left on the floor in our institutions, and it's
the point.
It's disturbing.
Yes, because we have relegated, right, the technical term, the ontology and the axiology, who gets to decide what is good and just and rigorous, to a relatively small group of folks. Most of our research, I did a talk to a group of philanthropists and their staff about the dangers of anchoring on research and policy rooted in weird. Everybody should go look it up.
Yeah.
Right? Rooted in white, largely male, Western ideologies, right? And what we think is that normative experience. It loses all of the genius that we started the podcast with, talking about the true power of a multiracial democracy. There are things that I bring to the table coming from the community that I come from. There are things that the young people that I have partnered closest with that are court involved, that were homeless children, right? Opportunity youth, juvenile justice, felons, whatever you want to call them. I call them genius zone.
Genius. Mm-hmm.
Genius that can smell it, that can see it a mile away.
Mm-hmm.
Something one of my young people said to me when we started Rhodes, and that was the series of charter schools. So Rhodes Charter High Schools. We opened one school in East New York, Brownsville, Brooklyn, and the other in the South Bronx, serving court-involved, juvenile adult offense, homeless, period before application, or in transitional housing, or child welfare involved through their life course. That were also, because of where we started our conversation, lifing, missed significant portions of school, were out of school by design, sometimes through system involvement. Genius. My young people said to me, brilliant young man. The only thing somebody ever taught me was they taught me how to hustle. And I was like, well, I could put you onto a new game. Mm-hmm. Have it in you. There is an innate genius. There is a hunger. Oh, I could teach you different things. But I don't know that we're affording everyone those kinds of opportunities.
Absolutely not. I'm thinking of 3 things. One is Bill Strickland, I think his name is, from the Manchester Guild. He said the only thing wrong with people in poverty is they don't have no money. We made a whole lot of other problems, but really fundamentally it is about they don't have the money. It doesn't mean they don't have all the other things, right? So we've created a narrative around one piece of information.
What happened when folks had a child tax credit? Disproportionately, right. Folks used it for education.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. The other is my uncle, who I've mentioned on here, Dr. Richard Green, was the first Black superintendent in Minneapolis schools. He was also the first Black chancellor of the schools in New York. He was there for 1 year before he died from asthma in 1989. Mm-hmm. And he got his PhD from Harvard. He went to Oxford College here in the Twin Cities. He also spent some time in the county juvenile detention center as a teenager, and ended up getting engaged in community because people saw his genius despite his actions, and they nurtured him and they got him in boxing clubs, and they put him community wrapped around him.
Yes.
Right. They didn't disregard him. They didn't just minimalize him based on behaviors of acting out, but they knew acting out was a sign of something else. And so they nurtured him. And
Yes.
so he moved through being a juvenile detention, um, occupant, to occupying Harvard, to then moving into the first of these seats, and creating quite an example for a generation of educators, frankly, becoming an inspiration to students and certainly inspiring my leadership. So the impact that he has had has rippled beyond the roles that he's had into community and to other careers in ways that can never really be formally calculated.
Yes.
And then the last one was my mom, right? Anytime I start thinking I was cute or very smart, my mom would say, there's always someone cuter and smarter. And there's a lot of them that are sitting in spaces that you will never have to go to. Right. The people that are sitting in jail are probably the most brilliant, some of the most brilliant people that were the most misunderstood, that had not the same level of love, trust, and infrastructure that you have in your life. So don't think yourself as being higher than anyone else. Think, just count your blessings, sort of thing. And I think about that often because I think that it's so easy to assign a description and a story to people that we haven't met. And we do that in our workplaces, we do that in our community, we do it in our schools, and not explore. And I think that the thing for me that I love the most, and it was sometimes challenging in the space that we occupy, is the level of inquiry and examination doesn't go that deep sometimes.
You're trying to get me to pick up something. So, okay, I'll lean and I'll go ahead on and do it.
Okay.
If there are no natural checks on us in philanthropy, especially when you have your own corpus, especially when it is a family foundation, and ways of being and knowledge have resulted in the amassing of extraordinary wealth. You can convince yourself that you know, and your knowing supersedes all knowing, right? So then what is this checks and balance? It is a rare group of humans that are incentivized for being and doing something, that have the humility to say, and yet I don't know that thing. I have seen it. I mean, I speak glowingly about having started my career at the Rakes Foundation, working for and with Jeff and Trisha Rakes as a couple that I experienced as, when they know better, they do better. When they see, and they were open to seeing how systems impact different people. Where I could say, during COVID, I left Seattle the weekend that the first two people died in the nursing homes in the suburb of Seattle, went back home to Harlem. And I could say, there are things that y'all don't understand. They're warehousing Black and brown bodies in cold storage vehicles. I can see that in my neighborhood. If we're not in, again, right relationship to be able to say that, and it not be a thing you see on the news that is
right. Or a threat, a threat to a belief system, but an expansion of what might be actually occurring.
Yeah, and we don't have to get into the debate. Is your experience of COVID better, worse, more impactful? But rather, here's my experience. And here's what it's leading me to believe about not only historic fractures in our healthcare system, but whose bodies matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? That's part of trust-based philanthropy when we can be in those kind of conversations where I could say, I did not leave my home for 11 months. I ultra quarantined because I did not want to be an unaccompanied human being, Black person, in a hospital, in a city with an explosive COVID rate, and someone having to make a decision about who gets the ventilator. The stereotype threat and the automaticity, right?
Mm-hmm. And these are the types of threats that we're navigating, either that explicitly or not, in our world. And I mean, I was sort of the same way, right? Like I had a leased car at the time, and I think I got it in 2019. And when I turned it in 3 years later, I think I had 7,000 miles on it because I wasn't going anywhere. Right. And my mother came home for hospice. People that listen to the podcast knows this, in 2020, just 2 days before George Floyd was murdered. And how her last 6 weeks could have looked very differently if I would have known what my options were. But similarly,
yes,
if I put her in care somewhere, I'll never see her again. And if they have to make a choice, they may not choose her. So I have to step into place and space that is uncomfortable for me.
Yes.
Because of my love for her, right? That she will be with us, and we're going to have to protect her in the time that she has. And it's going to look really difficult, and I'm going to have to figure it out. And I think
that is a system making a gladiator out of you and me.
Yeah. Yeah.
With all of this education, all of the resourcing, it is a ever-present reality.
It is. And I'm glad we landed on that, because I think, understanding the decisions that we make in our educated, like professional executive heads, where it's like, man, I don't even know what to do with this. I know that education should be the great equalizer, but at the end of the day, if you in the hospital, I'm in the hospital, I don't know if it's going to matter.
With no voice, no advocate, no one watching, yeah. I can't guarantee that I would get the ventilator.
Right. And I think that if we translate that into kids that don't know how to articulate, that are navigating some tough personal issues, if I had been in high school and had to navigate that, right, I wonder if I would have finished.
Yeah.
Right. I wonder if I would have had enough in my tank to have finished. And of course, I have my parents, but when I think about the level of grief and loss and the things that our children were navigating across this country during that time period, the threat of loss of life in multiple ways, not just one, what that means and how we deal with what they're holding, and how our educational system and support systems honor those feelings as valid and real, and not just a diagnosis to be prescribed to, but a human to be in relationship with. Yes. Right. So that they can wrap around them in the ways that they've wrapped around us and my uncle and so many others. That's what I hope. And so, as we close, what is bringing you hope?
What is bringing me hope? What is bringing me hope is that we have a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. What is bringing me hope is that in having a seat at the table, we are affording not just single narratives, right? But we're bringing all of our genius, all of our experience, all of our truth, all of what we see and know and experience, not experienced, but still experienced today, into the discourse, into the conversation about, and where do we start? Well, let's start with the stereotype threat. Let's start with, for whom is the opportunity to fail in childhood afforded, and for whom is it not, right?
That's a good damn question.
I think the other thing that's giving me hope is that exponentially more people saw, I'm going to use my language, were moved, struck, and inspired through COVID, through the confinement and the forced experience of watching George Floyd's murder on TV on a loop. I don't know if we had not been in a COVID confinement, would so many people have seen. But when you see certain things, you cannot unsee it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we might have been in service of, and again, I'm going to use my language, I was prepared to work my natural life for folks to inspire, to help people see certain things. Acts of God and man created that overnight.
Yeah, no doubt.
The question is, now what are we going to do with the moment? How are we going to keep the moment open? How do we resist the forces that would box us into a warring at a community or an interpersonal level?
Mm-hmm.
My trauma is worse than your trauma. My harm is worse than your harm. My need is worse or more significant than yours. How do we actually resist that thing is I think the work, but folks see.
Yeah. And, we're coming up on the 4th anniversary.
Yes.
And there's a lot of narrative about philanthropy going backwards and DEI going backwards. Are you feeling that?
I am watching it.
Yeah.
I am not feeling that in my day-to-day experience.
Yeah.
Again, I have the benefit
of a board
that affords me coverage, that affords our mission coverage, where I am starting 9 months into my tenure. We are having conversations about governance to controls and how to, if we have shared ambition and we are unapologetically in service of education justice, equity, racial equity in education, then how do we actually renegotiate governance controls, use the tools and resources, all of the tools and resources afforded to us to drive toward this mission, drive toward this shared vision?
My question, and I can't believe I didn't ask this, is about board governance. And I have a love for governance that I think is growing because I think it's such a key position to hold. I think it is a position of importance.
Yes.
It is a position that will either move or stop progress. It's a position that either supports or extinguishes.
Yes.
And you have given such honor to the board that you have. Can you say anything about the importance of governance or what it looks like to feel supported in your role and what the board is explicitly doing? Because I think that there's a lot of folks on boards that are looking to figure out how they can take their governing to the next level.
Yeah. And I don't think we figured it all out, but we're working through the messy middle.
Yeah.
There's personal regard, respect, and faith that we are in service of the same things, right? And so I think that opens up and unlocks different kinds of conversations. But I'm going to back into this response by saying I serve on and have served on a lot of community, regional, national boards. And I am typically asked to serve on a board because somebody needs me to block and tackle, to afford them coverage, to be in the room, to say the thing. So I was actually recently asked to join a board. And I said, you sure you need me to join the board? That's always where I start. Do you need me in the room? Are you needing me to elevate you, lend credibility? Like, what do you need? Because I'm always negotiating what I can do in service of you. And do I actually need to occupy that board seat in order to do it? Person said, yeah, I need you in the room. And I said, okay, well, what are the 2 or 3 things that you need me to go hard on? I said, I don't need you to go hard on anything. I had to lean in. I was what? You're not leading me to infiltrate because I am so used to being asked to infiltrate. to go in there and represent or present a single aspect of my identity. And folks will usually tell you, right, when you're in this kind of negotiation, right? You need Dr. Shorter? You need policy speak?
We need a diverse perspective.
Yes. Okay, well, how diverse you want me to be? And am I the only person? And diverse with who?
Yeah.
Right?
And on behalf of whom?
Exactly. So in those conversations, you are negotiating. I think it's worth noting that Nellie Mae has a board that has supported the journey, that has supported the positioning, that has been a co-construct, right, in navigating and landing its current mission, its ambition, has done so much in and with me as a CEO. I think of John Jackson and Justice is the foundation, the new report that they put out.
Yeah.
Nellie Mae is the largest education justice funder in this country. We are in service of the same things. We are having conversations about our read of where and how the field is evolving, what it means. I asked person that is now transition after serving for 17 years, but kicked off our March board meeting following right behind John Jackson, right behind Rally as a comms partner, grounding into what are we hearing and how is the narrative around education evolving and evolving quite rapidly and dramatically. The conversation that was had in the days and the months right after George Floyd's murder and the conversation that's being had now, very different. The opening and aperture for DEI, for all things equity, very different. Had a colleague come in who led our strengthening coalitions, partnership, and movement portfolio, do a state of the region update, right? Like, let's ground into the reality for those in whom we are in service of, and then let's step back and make meaning together about what we believe we're called into. And if you have that level of mission alignment, if you are negotiating, what are we in service of? Are we in service of the same thing? Then the governance conversations and the controls are very different.
Yeah. And how much time do you think that you all spend on that? Because I have sat on a lot of boards, been engaged with a lot of boards, and a lot of times it is tactical updates on what's occurring in the organization. And there's often not a lot of time spent on what's occurring in the environment. And how does that weigh into the strategies?
I have been, since I joined, sitting on the same side of the table as my board chair and my board. So we are negotiating in good faith.
Yeah.
Our 2-day, the arc of our 2-day. And I'm saying, okay, Warren, generally speaking, as a foundation that aspires to be rooted in community solution and innovation, but that unapologetically is driving toward impact. And impact is defined as education, justice, equity, and racial equity in education.
Yeah.
That's our North
Star. You are clearly partnered on mission.
Yes.
And committed to exploring the questions, the critical questions that will allow you to have the type of sustained impact.
Yes.
Right. So the commitment
is. And we're doing 4 things.
Yeah.
We're talking about what is the moment?
Yeah.
What are we called into? How is it evolving? For whom is it creating new burn, new pressure? And then we go back to our second, how are we responding? And what are we called into?
Yeah.
And I think when you can have those kinds of conversations, even from a governance and a control perspective.
Yeah. And so is there flexibility, maybe not flexibility in terms of what you're trying to do, but is there flexibility on your approaches? So you guys are learning, and then are you evolving, or are you saying, well, it's not yet time to evolve? Or, I mean, I imagine it's a part of it, but if you needed to pivot, could you pivot?
I have no reason to believe that we wouldn't,
Yeah.
right? So here's how I'll say it. 9 months in, I framed my last, and we have quarterly 2-day board meetings, framed the arc of the last executive session, right? I'll pull the curtain back a little, was we've been in a 3-part conversation. Here's where we started in my first. Here's where we were at December. Here's where we are now in March.
Mm-hmm.
I take it as a truth that it is my job as president and CEO to be elevating the emergence. What I see, we are called into negotiating with my board chair, the committee chairs, the treasurer around how we calibrate to do that. But also knowing that it isn't a singular endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't always my voice.
Right.
That's why I staged a member of the team. Yes, come forward. You lead our coalition's movement work.
Yeah.
What's the update from our region?
Mm-hmm.
Where and how have governors declared they're going to move capital, the tax levy dollars? What are we hearing from our partners about what they perceive they're called into?
Mm-hmm.
We'll be on a journey, right? Starting in December, I started communicating to the field about what are our strategic priorities. We're doubling down. Sometimes a shift in leadership signals a shift in strategy or a hard pivot. There isn't a hard pivot here.
Yeah, that's good.
Doubling and tripling down on our commitment to education justice, equity, racial equity in education. Not pulling back on that. We are getting clearer through deeper engagement with our partners. What are we called into?
Yeah.
I know that we could land that and fully understand that without allowing some of what will happen by design over the next 12 months to play out.
Mm-hmm.
So I won't rush to reset things. We're going to double down, triple down on our 3 strategies. Investment in POC-led youth, community, education organizers and nonprofits around school and community transformation. Investments in district personnel to help them more efficiently, effectively partner with community,
Mm-hmm.
serve diverse populations in ways that they have not and have not been forced to in the past. And then again, our coalitions, partnerships, and movement work. And I'd say that differently. That's the grassroots organizations from the state agencies, right, to the policy shops, down to the hyperlocal grassroots. How do we support those folks to come together?
I love it.
As we do that, I think we'll learn what is our role, what is the work to be done, but then also what is Nellie Mae's work uniquely to be done.
Yeah. Okay, last question for real, which is Toya Randall, Voice, Vision, Value, Black Women Leading in Philanthropy. I know it just makes me smile every time I think about it.
Yes.
And the opportunity to partner with her in the telling of the stories of our genius, of our voice, of our vision. Like, I mean, I just love it so much. So I always like to do a little bit of a shout out to the women that are out there leading in big ways, that have been listening and supporting Toya's work and my work and your work. But what a vision to make sure that our narratives and our stories are told.
Wow. Okay. So the question is, when I think of Toya,
the question, I don't even know what the question is other than Toya, right? And maybe the question is around the importance of our stories being told. And why is that important?
Yes.
Right? I mean, every interaction I have, I just get more inspired, and I think about my life, my leadership journey, like where I could be headed, where I could push more, where I could, who I could inspire through this. And so it's just been a gift for me to hear and see all these things that I probably wouldn't even have the time or know where to go. And so it's just been a gift.
You know, so and you say Toya's name and I smile, and it is a spirit singing because she is in so many ways the embodiment of sisterhood, sponsorship, wise counsel, a punch and a hug
A
sometimes.
punch, a hug, and a laugh all in one
Exactly.
sentence.
And she is also one of the few people that is so attuned that she will send the, hey, sis, how you doing?
Yeah.
You all right? And you can be honest about where you are in any moment, any day, in the arc of doing the work, because you are not always okay doing this work.
Yeah.
Right? Because it is, even with all the upstream support, a board that you find great value and respect you, we are asking a field and industry to do something fundamentally counter to how all of our systems have been designed and would naturally lend in themselves, right?
Yeah.
And that we can have the quiet conversations, and she is gathering us and pulling us together to rest, to rejuvenate, to laugh, to cry together, to talk about how do you keep going, but also when you don't have it, how do you tap out and say, who is on tap next?
That's right.
Right? Because I don't know that what it takes to get us to these roles and what it takes to do the role, to lead the work in the way that we are convicted by our own experience, by our own proximity. I moved for the job, and I'm never giving up my home in Harlem. And so I still have my home in Harlem, and I could have lived anywhere. And I picked Harlem, and I'm staying in my hood, and I love my community, right? So there are things that are near and present, the ways in which systems exert force, the ways in which, yeah, there are times when I have to go to war in my community, and I'm blowing up 311 when I'm home in Harlem. I'm paying all this money.
and, and they don't plow. Well, you don't have snow like we have snow.
And you can't pick up my garbage,
Right. I know. I feel you on that.
right?
I feel
So
you on a
all
lot
of
of
it,
it. Yeah.
right? Like all the things, and we are not divorced from the experience. We are not inoculated by our roles.
Yeah.
Every day, I navigate the world as a Black woman, as a dark skinned, as a brown skinned Black woman.
And your position
Yeah,
didn't give you, I mean, you financially, you have more latitude to navigate. But in
absolutely.
those other demographics, you navigating the same thing with more resources.
More resources and choices, right?
Choice.
And so, yes, I choose me and I choose us.
You choose me and you choose us. Love that. Mhm.
Right. And so I think that's when I hear Toya's name, when I hear voice, vision, value, it is a group of women that are like minded, that are choosing us. And our love for each other calls us into really hard jobs, really hard work with joy, with glee. And when we don't have the joy, when we don't have the glee, we can hug each other, we can support each other to get back to the love, to the joy, to the and we fight tomorrow.
Yeah, I love that. And what I would add too is that we can go through a set of experience that feels isolating until we come in community and we realize that we have
Yes.
another sister right in another state going through the same thing. And there is something about being able to navigate that together,
Yes.
knowing that it's not you, it's not me, it's not you, it is a system.
Yes.
And we have to consistently remind ourselves of that. And Toya is excellent at that reminder.
Yes.
Right. You can go in and come out and think it's you.
Yes.
Right. And it's because of you that it went further than it would have went. And you can never really, you can't forget that. And I think that's the value of what she's putting together and telling her stories.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.